Well, we've seen a sickening rise in anti-Semitism across the West since the brutal attack against Israel on October 7, but no more so than at our universities here at home. We've seen anti-Israel encampments, campus buildings occupied, classes interrupted, and Jewish students harassed. So much so, many have felt unsafe to even go to class. Well, universities are now being urged by MPs from Labor and the Coalition to urgently adopt an internationally accepted definition of anti-Semitism amid the ongoing conflict. Joining me as one of those fighting for this change, Liberal MP Julian Leeser. Julian, why is it so important that universities define anti-Semitism? I thought everyone knew what anti-Semitism was.
Well, clearly our universities don't know what anti-Semitism is, James, because the way in which our universities have failed to deal with the anti-Semitism that we've seen on campus, both before and after the 7th of October, has been quite breathtaking. We formed at the beginning of this parliament in 2022 the Parliamentary Friends of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. I'm one of the co-chairs, along with the Labor MP Josh Burns and the Independent MP Allegra Spender. We formed this group because we are seeing Holocaust denial grow, and we're seeing the modern manifestations of anti-Semitism grow. Things like Holocaust denial, but things like calling Israel a racist country, using Nazi iconography and imagery to describe Israel, making individual Jewish Australians responsible for the actions of the government of Israel. All of these things are the modern manifestations of anti-Semitism, and they're not being called out. And so we wrote to the university vice-chancellors back in 2022. Australia has 39 universities. Only 5 have adopted this definition, and it just beggars belief, but it speaks of the problems that we have at universities at the moment, where universities are failing to recognise anti-Semitism, they're failing to call it out, and they're failing to do anything about it.
Can I just pick you up on something you just said there? You said that you've contacted universities. This was back in 2022.
That's correct.
So you were calling for this recognition of anti-Semitism long before the October 7 attacks ever happened.
That's exactly right. Australia was signed up to the International Holocaust Alliance definition of anti-Semitism in 2021. Scott Morrison, as Prime Minister, said we adopt this as a people and as a nation. If the Government of Australia, with multi-partisan support, can approve of this definition, why then have only 5 universities adopted it? Many of the other universities said, oh, we've got general anti-racism policies and this is not a problem for us. But that's the whole point. What universities have failed to do, in the same way the Australian government has failed to do and the Human Rights Commission have failed to do, is to see the particularity of anti-Semitism, to see the fact that anti-Semitism morphs and manifests itself in different ways, to see that it's all about othering people for a set of problems that people have rather than taking personal responsibility for those problems. All of this leads ultimately to greater social division. And why this is so important on university campuses is not just about Jewish students and Jewish staff. It's about the next generation of our leaders. Because if we're not addressing anti-Semitism in front of the next generation of our leaders, and our next generation of leaders think it's acceptable to turn a blind eye to this, then I fear for the culture of Australia in the future, James. I think we're setting ourselves up for a country that will not be a nice place to live.
I can't understand how only, did you say 5 out of 39 universities have responded favourably to this request?
That is correct.
I can't imagine any other group of people, whether it's a racial group, whether it's a particular group based on sexual orientation or whatever, who have been harassed and marginalised as much as our Jewish community, and the universities being so slow or unmotivated to do all they can to address it. What explains this lack of motivation? Well,
there's a famous British author called David Baddiel who wrote a book that's called Jews Don't Count. And effectively he said that any other minority group would be called out for racism against those minorities, except the Jewish people. And this is in part because of a philosophy that's been taught on our campuses for a generation now. This woke idea about the oppressors and oppressed, this woke idea about privilege, that somehow white people are privileged and non-white people are oppressed. And if you want to get rid of white privilege, it starts with Jewish privilege. This is a terrible idea because it basically says that people's futures are predetermined. Yeah. And I don't believe that, and I think most Australians don't believe that. And the idea that you can ping this all on the Jewish people is deeply, deeply anti-Semitic. And I think that is what is motivating universities not to sign up to this, because they don't want the backlash, the university leaders who are almost to a person, completely weak on this. They don't want the backlash from their woke staff saying, oh, you can't do this because this is somehow advantaging our privileged people. I think this is a terrible thing, and we've got to do something about it. And that's why, together with Josh and Allegra, we formed this group. We wrote to the universities. I think we've got to start asking ourselves, should universities continue to receive government funding if they're not prepared to sign up to a definition of anti-Semitism that the Australian government has signed up to and that has multi-partisan support? I think while Minister Clare is negotiating the university compacts with universities, he should be raising this issue.
Is it the case simply that, Vice-Chancellors are not silly people. I mean, they're incredibly intelligent, incredibly educated. Is it the case that they know exactly what anti-Semitism is? They really just don't want to do anything about it, which is why they've allowed the encampments to continue, why instead of telling those students you either move or you are suspended or expelled from our institution, we've got, for instance, Sydney University, they're dealing and negotiating with these young people.
I think it's often tempting for us to think that anti-Semitism is something that's confined to the undereducated. But the sad truth of the history of anti-Semitism is that some of the best educated people have been the greatest propagators of anti-Semitism. In the 1930s and 40s, there was a conference at Wannsee that was developed that met to develop the final solution. In other words, the gassing and murder of Jewish people in the Holocaust. You know, half the people who attended that were either medical doctors or who had PhDs. What the Vice-Chancellors are doing here, they know exactly what anti-Semitism is. They know exactly what phrases like river to the sea means. They know exactly what intifada means. The fact that they know this and are doing nothing shows that they are deeply complicit in this. This is why, James, I've been calling for a judicial inquiry into anti-Semitism on campus, because this isn't just confined to Sydney University. It's right across the sector. And we can't have a situation where Jewish staff and Jewish students are going to university and are not being able to do their work and access their education without being harassed and intimidated. We wouldn't accept it with any other group of Australians. And what is worse is that we are basically teaching every other Australian who attends university it's acceptable to treat Jews like that. And that is not what I think we should.
Well, I mean, your call for an inquiry into anti-Semitism, I mean, the government want an inquiry, but it's got to be a broad inquiry into all racism, not just into anti-Semitism, almost like they don't want to admit there is a particular issue with the treatment of Jews. They don't want to admit that. Is that your reading of their reluctance to support that inquiry?
So it's twofold, and I'm absolutely sick and tired of this. I'm sick and tired of anti-Semitism just being lumped in with general racism, because it is different. You know, anti-Aboriginal racism doesn't have a conspiracy behind it. Anti-LGBTI sentiment doesn't have a conspiracy behind it. Islamophobia doesn't have a conspiracy behind it. Only anti-Semitism does. And it is something that morphs in every generation. But secondly, this government wants to give this task to the Australian Human Rights Commission. This is the body that is charged with dealing with racism in our country. But for 6 months, they failed to condemn the anti-Semitism that we've seen in this country. The President of the Commission, at Senate estimates, failed to call out anti-Semitism. She could not even condemn Hamas for the terror attacks. And the new Race Discrimination Commissioner, handpicked by Mark Dreyfus, who would be doing this inquiry, refused to say that from the river to the sea was a violent statement. He said, it'd depend on the context. And then they've got lots of staff and contractors that have been engaged in anti-Semitic acts, including the doxing of Jewish artists, and have called for Jews to be treated in the most horrendous fashion. There is systemic racism at the Australian Human Rights Commission, and that's why Jewish communal organisations have said to the government and have said in media statements that the Human Rights Commission is completely the wrong organisation to do this. I'm calling on the government to adopt my bill for a judicial inquiry so we can get to the bottom of this, because when the culture is rotten in a sector, it's only a judicial inquiry that can get to the bottom of this and achieve the cultural change all Australians want.
Absolutely. Well, Julian Leeser, thanks for joining me tonight. I really appreciate your time and the work that you're doing.
Thank you, James.